I'm Commander Laura Riviera, 34, and I built a distinguished military career from the ground up, serving multiple combat deployments and developing training protocols now used across the Pentagon. For years, I financially supported my veteran father, covering his medical bills, business failures, and living expenses while he dismissed my service as pushing papers overseas. But when he publicly humiliated me at our hometown's veteran reunion, telling me to go home and stop embarrassing him in front of everyone, I made a decision that changed our relationship forever. Have you ever been completely dismissed by someone you sacrificed everything for? If so, drop your story in the comments. You're definitely not alone. Before I dive into what went down that night, let me know what city you're watching from. And if you've ever had to cut off someone who couldn't respect your worth, smash that like button and subscribe for more real stories about drawing the line when family crosses it. What happened when that general found me in the parking lot? You won't believe it. I was 7 when I first understood that my father was a hero. Not the cape-wearing kind, but the real type who carried himself with quiet authority and spoke about duty like other people talked about the weather. He'd served in the Army through the late 70s and early 80s, nothing glamorous by his telling, but the way other veterans nodded when he spoke told a different story. Every weekend seemed to bring another cookout, parade, or gathering where men with weathered faces and firm handshakes would clap him on the shoulder and swap stories I was too young to fully understand. I followed him everywhere. While other kids complained about boring adult parties, I collected challenge coins and listened to tales of distant bases with names I couldn't pronounce. My father never encouraged my fascination, but he didn't discourage it either. He'd let me tag along to the VFW hall, where I'd sit quietly in the corner, absorbing conversations about brotherhood and sacrifice that felt more important than anything happening at school. By the time I turned 18, enlisting felt as natural as breathing. I'd grown up surrounded by the language of service, the rituals of remembrance, the unspoken understanding that some things mattered more than personal comfort. My father didn't try to talk me out of it, but he didn't exactly celebrate either. When I told him I'd chosen a different branch, he just shrugged and said the military would teach me discipline I clearly needed. Basic training was everything the stories had promised and nothing like them at the same time. The physical demands I'd expected, but the mental transformation caught me off guard. I discovered I was good at leading, better at problem-solving under pressure, and surprisingly capable of earning respect from people who didn't give it easily. My letters home were full of pride and small victories, each one an attempt to bridge the gap between his service and mine. My first deployment came faster than expected. The letters I wrote from overseas were longer, more detailed, full of experiences I hoped would make him proud. I described the weight of responsibility, the bonds formed under stress, the way serving your country changed how you saw everything else. His responses were brief, usually about local news or family gossip, never acknowledging what I was going through or what it meant. When his construction business hit rough times during the recession, I didn't hesitate to help. The checks I sent weren't small, and they came regularly, even when my own finances were tight. He accepted them without much comment, the same way he'd accepted everything else I'd tried to give him over the years. When he needed surgery and his insurance coverage fell short, I covered the difference. When his truck broke down, I handled the repairs. It wasn't charity in my mind, it was what family did for each other. The pattern continued through multiple deployments and promotions. I'd send money when needed, visit when I could, and attend the same veteran events we'd gone to when I was a child. But something had shifted in those gatherings. I wasn't the wide-eyed kid in the corner anymore, but I wasn't quite welcome at the adults' table either. My father's introductions grew shorter, more vague, like my service was something mildly embarrassing rather than something to acknowledge. I told myself it was generational differences, branch rivalry, or just his way of keeping me humble. Veterans were notorious for their dark humor and casual insults, after all. But the dismissiveness felt personal, targeted, like he was actively working to minimize what I'd accomplished rather than simply failing to celebrate it. The financial support continued because he needed it, and despite everything, I needed to believe we still had the bond I'd treasured as a child. Every check I wrote, every bill I covered, Every time I showed up when he called was an investment in the relationship I remembered, the one where his approval mattered more than anyone else's. I kept thinking that eventually he'd see what I'd become, acknowledge what I'd achieved, and recognize that his daughter had followed his example in ways that mattered. But approval never came. Instead, I got tolerance, acceptance of my help coupled with a persistent suggestion that my service wasn't quite real, wasn't quite enough, wasn't quite worthy of the recognition he'd give freely to others. I watched him praise neighbors' sons who'd served shorter deployments in safer positions while introducing me as someone who helped out overseas when pressed for details. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. At work, I led teams through complex operations, earned commendations, and advanced through ranks that demanded respect from everyone around me. At home, I was still the kid who'd tagged along to adult conversations, still waiting for permission to belong in spaces I'd earned the right to occupy. I started making excuses to skip some gatherings, claiming work obligations or prior commitments. The relief I felt when I didn't have to hear another dismissive introduction or watch him light up talking about someone else's achievements told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. But I kept writing the checks, kept answering the calls, kept hoping something would change. The hope was stubborn and stupid and completely resistant to evidence. I'd built my entire understanding of honor and service around his example, and admitting he didn't respect mine felt like admitting I'd misunderstood everything that mattered to me. So I kept showing up, kept supporting him financially and emotionally, kept waiting for the moment when he'd look at me with the same pride I'd seen him show for strangers. That moment was coming, but not in any way I could have anticipated. The shift started small, so subtle I almost missed it entirely. At a Memorial Day barbecue, I heard him telling a story about courage under fire that I recognized, not because I'd heard it before, but because it had happened to someone in my unit during our second deployment. He'd changed enough details to make it his own, but the core incident was identical, down to the specific equipment failure that had triggered the whole situation. I didn't call him out. Military stories had a way of traveling and morphing, and maybe he'd heard it from someone else who'd been there. But something about the way he told it, with the casual authority of personal experience, made my stomach tighten. I started paying closer attention to his tales, cross-referencing them with my own knowledge and contacts from various deployments. More inconsistencies emerged. Dates that didn't line up with his service record, locations he claimed to have served that didn't match his actual assignments, specialized training he described that would have taken months he couldn't account for. The stories weren't complete fabrications, but they were enhanced, embellished, borrowed from other people's experiences and presented as his own. The worst part wasn't the lying itself, it was watching how easily everyone believed him, how readily they offered the respect and recognition I'd been craving for years. These same people who dismissed my actual combat experience as different or easier hung on every word of his fictional adventures. When I tried to contribute to conversations about overseas service, sharing experiences that had shaped me profoundly, I'd get polite nods and quick topic changes. But when he launched into detailed descriptions of operations he'd never participated in, the room would fall silent with attention. The double standard was so blatant it felt deliberate. I began noticing how he positioned us differently at social events. He'd introduce other veterans by their rank and service record, but I was always just my daughter or the kid. If pressed for details about my military career, he'd offer vague responses that made it sound like I'd spent my time filing paperwork at some remote base. When people persisted with questions, he'd change the subject entirely. The financial dynamics started feeling different too. What I'd seen as family support began looking more like payment for his silence about my actual accomplishments. He was comfortable taking my money, comfortable calling when he needed help, but he couldn't stand the idea of anyone knowing where that help came from or what I'd done to earn it. His new circle of friends, mostly older veterans he'd met at the local American Legion, seemed to mirror his attitude. They'd make casual comments about modern military service being softer or easier, about how today's soldiers had it better than their generation. When I was present, these comments felt pointed, designed to put me in my place before I could claim equal standing. I started documenting the inconsistencies, not to confront him, but to convince myself I wasn't imagining the problem. Dates, places, unit designations, I had access to enough official records to verify basic facts, and the pattern was clear. He was living off borrowed valor while actively diminishing mine. The realization was devastating, but it also explained things that had never made sense before. His reluctance to discuss specifics about his own service, his discomfort when other veterans asked detailed questions, the way he'd redirect conversations away from military topics when anyone with real knowledge was present. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to live up to an example that was largely fictional, seeking approval from someone who couldn't afford to acknowledge my achievements because they highlighted his own limitations. Every deployment I'd completed, every promotion I'd earned, every real accomplishment on my record made his fabricated stories look smaller by comparison. The anger, when it finally came, was clean and clarifying. I wasn't upset about the lies themselves. People embellish, and veterans especially had a tradition of tall tales. I was furious about the hypocrisy, the way he'd accepted my sacrifices while systematically undermining my credibility, the years I'd spent funding his lifestyle while he worked to ensure I'd never receive the recognition I'd actually earned. But anger wasn't enough to break the pattern. I still showed up to family events, still answered his calls, still wrote checks when he needed them. The hope was harder to kill than the respect, and some part of me kept believing that if I just proved myself thoroughly enough, definitively enough, he'd have no choice but to acknowledge what I'd become. That illusion was about to shatter completely. The invitation arrived on official letterhead, addressed to my work office rather than my home. The annual veteran reunion in our hometown had grown into a significant event, drawing military families from across 3 counties and featuring speakers, memorial services, and formal recognition ceremonies. They were requesting my presence as an honored guest, specifically acknowledging my recent promotion and service record. I'd been to this reunion before, always as my father's daughter, always standing in the background while he held court with his stories and borrowed authority. This time, they wanted me there in my own right, wearing my dress uniform, representing everything I'd actually accomplished rather than everything he claimed to have done. The recognition felt long overdue and slightly surreal. After years of being introduced as someone who'd helped out overseas, official acknowledgement of my service record felt like validation from an unexpected source. I accepted immediately, requested leave, and arranged for my dress uniform to be properly fitted and updated with my current rank insignia. I didn't tell my father about the invitation. Some instinct warned me that he'd find a way to diminish it, to make it about him somehow, or to convince me it wasn't as significant as it felt. I wanted to walk into that reunion as myself, not as his disappointment, and see what happened when people met me as a military professional rather than as his offspring. The morning of the event, I spent extra time preparing. The uniform was perfect, every detail regulation and pristine. My ribbons told the story of deployments, commendations, and leadership positions that spoke for themselves. Looking in the mirror, I saw someone who'd earned the right to be there, regardless of family connections or anyone else's approval. I arrived at the reunion hall early, before the crowds, but after the organizers had finished their setup. The registration table was staffed by volunteers who greeted me with genuine warmth and obvious respect. They knew who I was, knew what I'd done, and treated me like someone whose presence mattered to the event's success. "Commander, we're so honored to have you here," the lead volunteer said, using my rank naturally and without hesitation. "Your table is reserved near the front, and General Morrison specifically requested to meet you during the reception." The difference was immediate and intoxicating. These people saw me as I actually was, not as a diminished version of someone else's story. They understood military hierarchy, recognized the significance of my rank and service record, and treated me accordingly. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged in a room full of veterans. I was reviewing the evening's program when my father appeared beside me. He'd arrived with his usual group of friends, all of them dressed in casual clothes scattered with military-themed accessories, unit patches, veteran ball caps, pins commemorating conflicts they may or may not have actually participated in. The contrast between their approach to military identity and mine couldn't have been starker. He looked at my uniform, at the registration badge identifying me as an honored guest, at the obvious deference I was receiving from event staff, and his expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for me to catalog. Surprise, confusion, something that might have been pride, and then, unmistakably, anger. "What are you doing here?" he asked, loud enough for his friends to hear, but not quite loud enough to draw attention from the broader crowd. "I was invited," I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. "As an honored guest." His friends clustered closer, sensing drama. I recognized most of them from previous gatherings, the men who'd laughed at his stories, who'd nodded along when he dismissed my service, who'd treated me like an inconvenient reminder of modern military service they didn't respect or understand. "Invited by who?" he demanded, as if my presence were some kind of mistake that could be corrected once the proper authorities understood the situation. Before I could answer, he'd made his decision about how this needed to go. In front of the registration table, in front of his friends, in front of anyone close enough to hear, he looked at me with undisguised contempt and said the words that would end everything between us. "Go home and stop embarrassing me. You don't belong here." The silence that followed felt infinite. Every conversation in our immediate area stopped, every face turned toward us, every person present became a witness to my father's public rejection of everything I'd worked to become. The registration volunteers stared in shock, my father's friends shifted uncomfortably, and I felt the weight of my dress uniform, every ribbon, every insignia, every symbol of earned respect, become suddenly, painfully heavy. I understood, in that crystalline moment, that this had never been about different branches or generational divides or any of the excuses I'd made for his behavior over the years. This was about his inability to tolerate my success because it exposed his fabrications. My actual achievements threatened the fictional narrative he'd built his identity around, and he'd rather destroy me publicly than risk being exposed as a fraud. The laughter started from his friends, nervous at first, but gaining confidence when he didn't correct them or defend me. Someone muttered something about participation trophies and modern military, and the group's amusement grew more pointed, more cruel. I was standing in my dress uniform, surrounded by my father's drinking buddies, being mocked for achievements they couldn't have imagined earning themselves. "I see," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the humiliation burning through my chest. "I understand completely." I didn't argue or defend myself or try to explain the invitation or my service record. There was no point. He'd made his choice about who deserved respect and who didn't, and no amount of evidence was going to change his mind. I simply nodded to the registration volunteers, who were watching the scene with obvious distress, and walked toward the exit. The walk to my car felt endless. Every step was measured, professional, maintaining the dignity my uniform represented even as everything inside me collapsed. I could hear conversations resuming behind me, voices discussing what they'd just witnessed, but I didn't turn around. I'd learned long ago that retreat could be tactical, strategic, a way of preserving resources for battles that actually mattered. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, still in full dress uniform, trying to process what had just happened. The physical space between me and the reunion hall felt symbolic of something larger, the final, unbridgeable distance between the relationship I'd imagined we had and the reality of what he thought of me. Years of financial support, emotional labor, and desperate seeking of his approval had led to this moment of perfect clarity about where I actually stood. My phone buzzed with a text from Martinez, a close friend from my unit who knew I was attending the reunion. "How's it going? Living it up with the brass?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Heading home early." Long story. He called immediately, because that's what good soldiers do when something feels wrong. I answered on the third ring, and his familiar voice provided an anchor I didn't realize I needed. "What happened?" he asked, cutting straight to the point the way military training had taught us both. I told him everything: the invitation, the preparation, my father's reaction, the public humiliation, the drive to my car where I was currently sitting in full dress uniform feeling like an idiot for ever thinking this would go differently. The story spilled out without editing, raw and complete, because Martinez had earned the right to hear the truth about everything. "Stay put," he said when I finished. "Don't leave yet." "Why?" I asked, though some part of me was already hoping he had a plan that would make this evening salvageable. "Because you didn't do anything wrong, and running away isn't going to fix it. You were invited there as an honored guest for a reason. Don't let some bitter old man's insecurity take that away from you." He was right, of course. I'd spent years allowing my father's opinion to define my worth, to determine whether my service mattered, to decide if I belonged in spaces I'd earned the right to occupy. Letting him drive me away from an event where I'd been specifically recognized and honored would be giving him exactly what he wanted, confirmation that his version of reality was the one that mattered. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The uniform still looked perfect, still represented everything I'd actually accomplished rather than everything someone else wanted me to be. My ribbons hadn't changed meaning because my father couldn't stand to acknowledge what they represented. My rank hadn't lost significance because he preferred the company of people who wouldn't question his stories. "You're right," I told Martinez. "I'm going back in." "Damn right you are," he said. "And when you do, you walk in there like you own the place. Because you earn the right to." The decision to return wasn't about proving anything to my father or his friends. That ship had sailed the moment he chose public humiliation over private conversation. This was about honoring the invitation I'd received, respecting the people who'd wanted me there, and refusing to let someone else's dysfunction determine whether I belonged in spaces I'd earned access to. I gave myself 5 more minutes in the car, using the time to compartmentalize the emotional damage and focus on the professional responsibility I had to the event organizers. They'd invited me specifically, had prepared a place for me, had arranged for me to meet other attendees who might benefit from the conversation. Walking away would be abandoning that obligation, and military training had taught me better than that. When I returned to the reunion hall, the atmosphere had shifted. Word had clearly spread about the confrontation, and I could feel eyes tracking my movement as I approached the registration table. But the attention felt different now, less curious, more supportive, like people were rooting for me rather than waiting for additional drama. "Commander," the lead volunteer said, relief obvious in her voice, "I'm so glad you came back. General Morrison has been asking for you." She gestured toward a distinguished older man in dress blues who was speaking with a small group near the memorial display. Even from a distance, his bearing and the deference of those around him made his rank unmistakable. This was the kind of leader my father had always pretended to be, someone whose authority came from actual service, actual sacrifice, actual achievements rather than borrowed stories and inflated claims. "He wanted to meet you specifically," she continued. "Your service record made quite an impression when we were planning tonight's program." The irony wasn't lost on me. While my father was holding court with his drinking buddies, sharing fabricated tales of military glory he'd never experienced, a general, someone with the authority to recognize real service, had specifically requested my presence at this event. The contrast between fantasy and reality couldn't have been clearer. I made my way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and brief conversations from other attendees who seemed genuinely pleased to see me there. Several mentioned having heard about my recent deployment, my unit's accomplishments, or specific commendations I'd received. These weren't casual compliments or polite small talk, they were informed comments from people who understood military service and recognized legitimate achievement when they saw it. General Morrison spotted me approaching and excused himself from his previous conversation. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and his bearing everything my childhood images of military leadership had promised. This was what earned authority looked like, what real command presence felt like, what decades of genuine service produced in a person. "Commander," he said, using my rank with the same natural authority I'd heard from the registration volunteers. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your work training new recruits has earned significant attention at the Pentagon. The reports from your commanding officers have been exceptional." The conversation that followed was the kind I'd been waiting my entire military career to have with someone from my father's generation. General Morrison asked informed questions about my service. understood the challenges of modern deployment operations, and treated my experiences as valuable and worthy of respect. He spoke about leadership, about the responsibility of training the next generation of military personnel, about the evolution of warfare and the unchanging importance of character under pressure. "The military needs more officers like you," he said as our conversation wound down. "People who understand that real leadership comes from earning respect rather than demanding it, from serving others rather than serving yourself." His words hit harder than he probably intended, creating a sharp contrast with everything that had happened earlier in the evening. Here was someone with the standing to judge military service, and his assessment of my value was completely opposite to everything my father had suggested over the years. "Thank you, sir," I replied. "That means a great deal coming from you." He nodded toward the crowd, where I could see my father still surrounded by his friends, still holding forth with animated gestures and dramatic expressions. "Not everyone understands what real service looks like," he said quietly. "But the people who matter do. Remember that." The general's words carried weight that went far beyond simple encouragement. This was validation from someone whose opinion actually mattered in military circles, whose assessment was based on evidence rather than personal insecurity, whose respect couldn't be bought or borrowed or fabricated. As we concluded our conversation and he moved on to other attendees, I realized something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of where I stood and whose approval actually counted for anything. The rest of the evening unfolded with the surreal quality of watching two different realities exist in the same space. In one corner, my father continued entertaining his friends with stories I now recognized as borrowed valor, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged on the details. In another area entirely, I found myself engaged in substantive conversations with military professionals who treated my service record as something worth discussing and learning from. The contrast became impossible to ignore when Colonel Hayes, the event's keynote speaker, sought me out during the reception. She'd heard about my work developing new training protocols and wanted to discuss potential collaboration on a manual she was writing for junior officers. The conversation was technical, professional, focused on real challenges facing modern military leadership, exactly the kind of discussion I'd hoped to have at events like this for years. "Your approach to stress inoculation training has caught attention at multiple levels," she said, referring to a program I developed during my last stateside assignment. "We're seeing measurable improvements in performance under pressure, and Command wants to expand implementation across additional training facilities." While we talked, I was peripherally aware of my father's voice rising and falling with another story, something about a helicopter rescue that sounded vaguely familiar from a movie I'd seen years earlier. His audience laughed at the appropriate moments, asked leading questions that allowed him to embellish further, and treated him like the military hero he'd always wanted to be but never actually was. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. In one conversation, I was being recognized for actual innovations in military training, discussed as a professional whose expertise had value at the institutional level. 20 feet away, my father was performing a version of military service that existed only in his imagination, receiving admiration for adventures he'd never experienced from people who didn't know enough to question the inconsistencies. "I'd like to invite you to present your findings at next year's training symposium," Colonel Hayes continued. "Your data on retention rates and performance metrics would be valuable for the broader military education community." The invitation was significant, the kind of professional recognition that could influence career advancement and provide platform for broader influence within military training circles. It was also exactly the sort of opportunity my father would have dismissed as just paperwork or not real military work, despite his complete inability to qualify for such recognition himself. As the formal program began, the difference in our standing became even more obvious. My father remained seated with his friends in the general audience, while I was invited to join the honored guests at the front of the room. The program included recognition of various military achievements, memorial tributes to fallen service members, and presentations highlighting significant contributions to military service and community support. When my name was called for recognition of distinguished service, the applause was genuine and sustained. I stood, acknowledged the recognition professionally, and felt the weight of actual earned respect from people whose opinions were based on evidence rather than preference. Looking out at the audience, I could see my father's face clearly, not proud, not supportive, but resentful and diminished. The recognition wasn't elaborate or lengthy, but it was real. My service record was read accurately, my achievements were presented without embellishment, and the citation focused on measurable contributions to military effectiveness and personnel development. Everything my father had been pretending to be for years was there in official language, documented accomplishments, and institutional recognition. During the memorial portion of the program, I found myself thinking about the soldiers I'd known who'd made the ultimate sacrifice, people whose service was beyond question, whose contributions were measured in lives saved rather than stories told, whose families would never have to wonder whether their loved one's military service was worthy of respect and recognition. The perspective was clarifying. I'd been seeking approval from someone whose own military service, while honorable, was being systematically inflated and mythologized to compensate for personal insecurity. Meanwhile, I'd been minimizing my own achievements, allowing his dysfunction to diminish accomplishments that spoke for themselves when presented to people with the knowledge and authority to evaluate them properly. As the evening concluded, several attendees approached me with follow-up questions about my work, invitations to future events, and expressions of appreciation for my service that felt both professional and personal. These weren't courtesy interactions or polite social obligations, they were meaningful exchanges between military professionals who recognized each other as equals. My father left early with his friends, avoiding any direct interaction with me, but making sure his departure was visible to anyone paying attention. The message was clear. He couldn't tolerate being in a space where my actual achievements overshadowed his fabricated ones, where his stories had to compete with documented reality. But by then, his opinion had lost the power to define my worth or determine my place in military circles. The aftermath wasn't immediately dramatic. I drove home in my dress uniform, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized, finally understanding the difference between seeking approval and earning respect. The evening had clarified something I'd been struggling with for years, the distinction between family loyalty and professional dignity, between supporting someone and enabling their dysfunction. Over the next few days, I made decisions that felt both inevitable and overdue. When my father called asking for help with a medical bill, I politely declined. When he needed assistance with VA paperwork, I suggested he contact the appropriate office directly. When relatives began calling to ask what had happened at the reunion, I explained the situation clearly and completely, without editorializing or seeking sympathy. He told me to go home and stop embarrassing him, I said when my aunt pressed for details. So I'm honoring his request by going home and staying there. The story spread quickly through our extended family and military community. People who'd witnessed the confrontation shared their perspective, often expressing shock at my father's public rejection of my service. Others who'd known both of us for years began reevaluating patterns they'd noticed, but never questioned, the way he'd accept my financial support while dismissing my military career. His tendency to embellish stories in ways that became more obvious once people started paying attention. Professional opportunities continued to develop. Colonel Hayes followed through on her invitation to present at the training symposium. General Morrison recommended me for a committee position that would influence future military education policy. And my commanding officer mentioned that my recent recognition had been noted by personnel responsible for promotion decisions. The contrast with my father's situation became increasingly stark. Without my financial support, he missed several payments that triggered consequences he'd previously avoided. His application for additional VA benefits was delayed due to incomplete paperwork I would have normally handled. Most significantly, his stories began facing more skeptical audiences as word spread about his treatment of his daughter, someone whose service record could be verified and whose achievements were a matter of official record. I didn't take satisfaction in his difficulties, but I didn't feel obligated to prevent them either. Natural consequences have educational value, and I'd been shielding him from the results of his choices for too long. The boundary between supporting family and enabling destructive behavior had become clear, and I'd chosen to respect it consistently rather than making exceptions based on guilt or misplaced loyalty. Months passed without direct communication between us. I heard updates through relatives who remained in contact with both of us, usually reports that he was struggling with various practical matters he'd expected me to handle indefinitely. Several family members suggested I should reconsider my position, that holding grudges wasn't healthy, that family forgiveness was more important than personal pride. But this wasn't about forgiveness or pride. It was about establishing clear boundaries around respect and reciprocity, about refusing to subsidize someone's lifestyle while they systematically undermined my credibility and achievements. The military had taught me about strategic withdrawal, about choosing battles worth fighting, about the difference between tactical compromise and strategic surrender. I'd spent years in strategic surrender mode, accepting my father's terms for our relationship even when those terms included public humiliation and systematic dismissal of my service. The reunion had forced me to recognize that no amount of financial support or emotional accommodation was going to change his fundamental need to diminish my achievements to protect his fabricated identity. The decision to maintain distance wasn't punitive, it was protective. I needed space to build relationships based on mutual respect, to develop professional opportunities without worrying about family interference, to exist in military circles where my service record spoke for itself rather than being filtered through someone else's insecurity. 6 months after the reunion, my father appeared at my door unannounced, looking older and less certain than I remembered. The conversation that followed would test every boundary I'd established and every lesson I'd learned about the difference between reconciliation and capitulation. He stood on my doorstep in civilian clothes that looked like they hadn't been updated in years, holding a folded newspaper and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, something between shame and confusion. Like someone who'd gotten lost and was finally asking for directions. "I didn't know they thought so highly of you," he said without preamble, gesturing vaguely with the newspaper. "There's an article about the training symposium. Your picture's in it." I recognized the publication, a regional military magazine that covered personnel movements, policy changes, and professional achievements across multiple installations. My presentation on stress inoculation training had apparently merited coverage, including a photograph and quotes from several senior officers about the program's effectiveness. "May I come in?" he asked, and something in his voice suggested the answer wasn't guaranteed. I let him in, offered coffee, and waited. The silence stretched uncomfortably while he examined my living room like he was seeing it for the first time, the commendations on the wall, the professional photographs, the books on military leadership and training methodology. Physical evidence of the career he'd spent years dismissing as somehow less legitimate than his own fabricated adventures. "People have been asking me questions," he said finally. "About the reunion. About why I said what I said. About what you've been doing all these years." I didn't respond immediately, recognizing this as the opening to a conversation I'd been expecting but not anticipating. He needed something from me: absolution, explanation, permission to restart our relationship on the same terms as before. But the evening at the reunion had taught me that some changes were irreversible, that certain lines couldn't be uncrossed once you'd chosen to step over them. "And what have you been telling them?" I asked. He shifted uncomfortably, the newspaper still folded in his hands like evidence he wasn't sure how to present. "I've been saying it was a misunderstanding. That I didn't realize how far your career had advanced. That maybe I spoke too quickly." The language was careful, calculated to minimize his responsibility while suggesting that circumstances had changed rather than acknowledging that his behavior had been inappropriate from the beginning. It was the kind of diplomatic non-apology that preserved his dignity while testing whether I'd be willing to pretend the reunion had never happened. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," I said calmly. "You told me to go home and stop embarrassing you because you didn't want me there. You said I didn't belong. You knew exactly what you were doing." His face flushed slightly, the way it always did when confronted with evidence that contradicted his preferred version of events. "I was having a bad day. Those guys, they get me wound up sometimes. You know how it is. But I did know how it was, which was exactly the problem. I knew about the stories he told that weren't quite true, about the way he accepted recognition for achievements that weren't quite his, about how my success threatened the narrative he'd built around his own military service. The reunion hadn't been an aberration, it had been the logical culmination of years of resentment and insecurity. I know exactly how it is, I agreed. That's why things need to be different now. We talked for over an hour, and gradually, the real conversation emerged from beneath his prepared statements and face-saving explanations. He'd been struggling financially without my support, professionally without my assistance with paperwork and administrative tasks, and socially as people began questioning his treatment of his daughter, whose military achievements were increasingly visible in official channels. I never meant for it to go this far, he said, and for the first time, his voice carried genuine regret rather than tactical contrition. Your success made me feel like my service didn't matter. Like everything I did was small compared to what you were accomplishing. It was the closest thing to honesty he'd offered, and I recognized the admission for what it was, not just about the reunion, but about years of systematic dismissal, financial dependency, and emotional manipulation designed to keep me in a subordinate position that made him feel more significant by comparison. Your service did matter, I told him. But that doesn't give you the right to diminish mine. And it doesn't mean I'm obligated to subsidize your lifestyle while you publicly undermine my career. The boundaries I established that afternoon were clear and non-negotiable. Future contact would be possible, but only on terms that included basic respect for my military service and professional achievements. Financial support was permanently ended. He needed to manage his own affairs like the adult he claimed to be. Most importantly, any attempt to minimize or dismiss my accomplishments would result in immediate withdrawal from whatever relationship we might rebuild. I can't promise it will be easy, he said as he prepared to leave. I've gotten used to thinking about things a certain way. Then you'll have to get used to it, I replied. Because the alternative is no relationship at all. He left with the newspaper still in his hand, looking like someone who'd received clear directions but wasn't sure he wanted to follow them. The conversation had been necessary but exhausting, forcing both of us to acknowledge realities we'd been avoiding for years. I watched him drive away and felt something between relief and sadness, the complicated emotions that come with setting boundaries that should have existed long before they became this difficult to establish. The months that followed tested the framework we'd established. He called occasionally, usually about practical matters, and our conversations were polite but careful. He'd ask about my work in general terms, avoiding specific questions about achievements or recognition that might require him to acknowledge the legitimacy of my career. I'd answer briefly, sharing information without expecting enthusiasm or support. The financial boundary held completely. When he hinted at needing help with bills or repairs, I'd suggest resources he could contact, but made it clear I wouldn't be providing direct assistance. When relatives asked if I was being too harsh, I'd explain that helping him meant enabling his dysfunction, and that real support sometimes required allowing people to experience the consequences of their choices. Most importantly, the respect boundary proved enforceable. The few times he slipped into old patterns, making dismissive comments about modern military service or suggesting my career was somehow less demanding than his had been, I'd end the conversation immediately. No arguments, no lengthy explanations, just a clear demonstration that certain behaviors would result in loss of access to me. The structure worked because it was consistent and predictable. He learned exactly what would happen if he crossed established lines, and more importantly, he learned that I was willing to enforce those consequences regardless of family pressure or personal cost. The relationship that emerged was smaller than what we'd had before, but it was based on mutual respect rather than his need for validation and my desperate seeking of his approval. Professional recognition continued to develop independent of family dynamics. My work on training protocols led to additional speaking opportunities, consultation requests, and eventually a position on a Pentagon committee developing new approaches to military education. The career advancement I'd been hoping my father would acknowledge became irrelevant to his opinion. I'd found validation from sources that actually mattered in my professional field. 2 years after the reunion, I received notification that I'd been selected for promotion to a position that would involve significant responsibility for training policy across multiple installations. The recognition represented everything I'd worked toward throughout my military career, validation from the highest levels that my contributions had institutional value. I didn't call my father to share the news. By then, I'd learned to celebrate achievements with people who could appreciate them fully rather than seeking approval from someone who could only offer conditional, diminished recognition. The promotion was significant enough to merit coverage in multiple military publications, so he'd learn about it eventually if he chose to pay attention. But that evening, as I reviewed the official notification and considered what the advancement meant for my career trajectory, I realized I was no longer waiting for his pride or approval to make my achievements feel real. The little girl who'd followed him to every veteran gathering, hoping to earn a place in his world, had grown into someone who'd built her own world where merit was measured by evidence rather than opinion. The recognition I'd craved from him for so many years had become irrelevant because I'd found it from sources that actually understood what I'd accomplished and why it mattered. General Morrison's assessment carried more weight than my father's opinion ever could. Colonel Hayes' invitation to present research meant more than his introduction at social events. The Pentagon committee appointment represented validation he could never provide because he'd never achieved anything comparable himself. I'd stopped needing his approval the moment I started receiving recognition from people whose judgment was based on knowledge rather than insecurity. The reunion had been a catalyst, but the real change had been my decision to stop accepting his terms for our relationship and start insisting on my own. That night, I realized I'd finally become the person I'd always wanted him to see me as, but more importantly, I no longer needed him to see it for it to be true. The final confrontation came, as these things often do, when I least expected it. 3 years after the reunion, I was attending a change of command ceremony at a nearby installation when I spotted my father in the audience. He was alone this time, wearing a suit instead of the military-themed casual wear that had become his signature, looking older and somehow diminished in the formal military setting. Our eyes met across the ceremony space, and I saw him recognize not just me, but the significance of my presence there. I was in dress uniform, seated with other senior officers, clearly present in an official capacity rather than as a spectator. The contrast with our last public military encounter couldn't have been more obvious. This time, my place was unquestionable, my rank visible, my role in the proceedings legitimate and documented. After the ceremony, he approached me with careful steps, like someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. The crowd around us included several officers I worked with regularly, people who knew my service record and treated my opinions with professional respect. He couldn't dismiss me as an embarrassment here without looking foolish himself. "I saw your name in the program," he said, gesturing toward the official ceremony materials. "Distinguished guest." That's quite an honor. I'd been invited to participate in the ceremony because of my role in developing training protocols that the incoming commander would be implementing. It was professional recognition at the highest level, acknowledgement that my work had institutional significance beyond individual achievement. The kind of honor he'd spent years suggesting I could never earn. "It's been a privilege to contribute," I replied, keeping my response professional and brief. Around us, other officers were engaged in post-ceremony networking, discussing policy implications and professional opportunities with the casual authority that comes from earned expertise. He stood there for a moment, clearly wanting to say something more substantial, but lacking the framework for a conversation that acknowledged the reality of what I'd become. The little girl who'd followed him to veteran events was gone, replaced by someone whose military accomplishments exceeded his own and whose professional standing was beyond his ability to diminish or dismiss. "I've been thinking about what you said," he finally continued, his voice lower now, more private. "About respect and boundaries. About how I treated you at the reunion." I waited, recognizing this as potentially the conversation we'd been avoiding for years, but needed to have eventually. The ceremony setting provided a natural limitation on how long or dramatic the discussion could become, which felt appropriate for the careful boundaries we'd established. I was wrong, he said, and the admission seemed to cost him significant effort. I was wrong about your service, wrong about what you'd accomplished, wrong about how I treated you. I was threatened by your success because it made me feel like my own service wasn't important. It was the apology I'd needed years earlier but had stopped expecting. Hearing it now, in a military setting where my achievements were visible and unquestionable, felt like closure on a chapter that had defined too much of my adult life. But it also felt like something I no longer needed, validation from someone whose opinion had lost the power to determine my worth. Thank you for saying that, I replied. It means something to hear it. We talked for a few more minutes, carefully and with obvious effort on his part to avoid the dismissive language that had characterized our interactions for so many years. He asked about my current assignment with genuine interest rather than skeptical questioning, acknowledged specific achievements he'd read about in military publications, and expressed something approaching pride in what I'd accomplished. But the conversation felt more like historical reconciliation than emotional reunion. The damage from years of systematic dismissal couldn't be erased by a single apology, no matter how sincere. The boundaries I'd established were protective rather than punitive, and they needed to remain in place regardless of his changed attitude. I hope we can have a better relationship going forward, he said as other ceremony attendees began dispersing around us. We can have an honest relationship, I corrected. One based on mutual respect and realistic expectations. But it won't be the same as what we had before because I won't accept the same terms. He nodded, seeming to understand that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, that reconciliation didn't equal restoration of previous dynamics. The relationship we might rebuild would need to acknowledge what had happened and incorporate safeguards to prevent it from happening again. As he walked away, I realized that the reunion confrontation had ultimately done both of us a favor. It had forced me to recognize that I didn't need his approval to validate my service or define my worth. And it had eventually forced him to confront the reality that his behavior had consequences, that family relationships required mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. The little girl who'd craved his recognition was gone, replaced by someone who'd earned respect from people whose opinions actually mattered in her professional field. The veteran reunion had been the moment I'd stopped being his disappointing daughter and started being my own accomplished person. 3 years later, standing in my dress uniform at an official military ceremony where my expertise was valued and my contributions were recognized, I understood that the best revenge against dismissal was indisputable success. The general had saluted me that night at the reunion, but more importantly, I'd learned to salute myself. So that's my story. How a public humiliation became the catalyst for reclaiming my worth and setting boundaries that actually stuck. Sometimes the people who should support us the most are the ones who need us to stay small so they can feel big. If this resonated with you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-respect? What was your breaking point? And for those who've been through something similar, how did you rebuild after cutting ties with someone who couldn't celebrate your success? Hit that like button if you believe respect should go both ways, even in family relationships. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because I share more stories about standing up for yourself and knowing your worth every week. And here's my question for you. Do you think I was too harsh cutting off financial support, or was it necessary to make my point? Let me know what you would have done in my situation. Your story might help someone else who's struggling with the same choice. Thanks for listening, and remember, you don't need anyone's permission to be proud of what you've accomplished.